I was fired from my job the same day my cheating wife said, "You're just a mistake I made. I'm taking the kids." Crushed, I wandered into a diner just to clear my head. An old woman sat down next to me, studied my face, and said, "You look just like my son, but he's been missing for 35 years. Her next 5 words changed everything. You know how they say when it rains, it pours? Well, whoever came up with that little gem of wisdom clearly never had a day like mine, because what happened to me wasn't just rain. It was a freaking Category 5 hurricane with a personal vendetta. The morning started normal enough, which should have been my first red flag. I rolled out of bed at 5:30 a.m. like I had for the past 9 years, 8 months, and 16 days. Not that I was counting or anything. The alarm clock's obnoxious beeping cut through the silence of our suburban bedroom, and I could already hear Marissa's annoyed sigh from her side of the bed. She'd perfected that particular sound over the years, turning it into an art form that could communicate exactly how much my existence irritated her without her having to waste actual words on me. I shuffled to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. Same tired eyes, same 5 o'clock shadow that never quite looked intentional, same Marcus Sullivan staring back at me like he was wondering how the hell we'd ended up here. 34 years old and looking every damn day of it, plus interest. The drive to Millfield Manufacturing was the usual 23 minutes of mind-numbing monotony, past the McDonald's with the perpetually broken ice cream machine, through downtown where the historic district was just a fancy way of saying we can't afford to update anything, and finally into the industrial park that housed the factory where I'd been clocking in since George W. Bush was still figuring out how to be president. I should have known something was off when I walked through those glass doors and Jenny at reception wouldn't make eye contact. Jenny, who usually greeted everyone with the enthusiasm of a golden retriever on espresso, suddenly found her computer screen absolutely fascinating. The pit in my stomach started forming right then, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe she was just having a rough morning. Maybe her cat died. Maybe her favorite reality TV show got canceled. Anything but what I was starting to suspect. But paranoia, as it turns out, is just anxiety with better instincts. Mr. Peterson, or Pete the Prick, as we called him when he wasn't around, was waiting for me by my workstation. Pete was one of those middle management guys who wore cheap suits and expensive cologne, thinking one would make up for the other. He had the kind of mustache that made you wonder if he was trying to look distinguished or if he'd lost a bet. "Marcus," he said, and I knew immediately that I was screwed. Not Mark, like he usually called me, not even Sullivan, but my full first name with all the ceremony of a funeral director. "We need to talk in my office." The walk to his office felt like that final mile death row inmates take, except the fluorescent lighting was worse, and the company motivational posters were more depressing than any last meal. Teamwork, because sometimes you can't do it all yourself, stared down at me mockingly. "Yeah, thanks for the pep talk, corporate wisdom." Pete closed the door behind us, which was about as subtle as a brick through a window. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, the squeaky one that put you at a psychological disadvantage, positioned just low enough that you had to look up at him like he was some kind of discount deity. "Marcus, you've been with us for almost 10 years, he started, shuffling through papers that I'm pretty sure were just for show. "You're a reliable guy, always on time, rarely miss work." Here it comes, I thought. That was going to change everything. But the company's going through some restructuring. Corporate's making cuts, and unfortunately, your position has been eliminated. Eliminated. Not let go, not laid off, but eliminated. Like I was some kind of error in a spreadsheet that needed to be deleted. 9 years, 8 months, and 16 days reduced to a single word that made me sound like a pest control problem. The rest was a blur of corporate speak and fake sympathy. Something about last hired, first fired policies, which was rich considering I'd been there longer than half the management team. Something about a generous severance package that would barely cover 2 months of mortgage payments. Something about how this was nothing personal, which has got to be the biggest load of bull ever invented because losing your livelihood is pretty damn personal. Thank you very much. They handed me a cardboard box, an actual cardboard box, like in the movies, and gave me 30 minutes to pack up my stuff under the watchful eye of security. Because apparently, after nearly a decade of loyalty, I was suddenly a flight risk who might steal the company's staplers or make off with proprietary knowledge about manufacturing widgets. 30 minutes to pack up 10 years of your life. It's amazing how little you accumulate when you really think about it. A coffee mug Jordan had made me in second grade with "World's Okayest Dad" painted on it in crooked letters. A picture of the kids from last Christmas. A stress ball that had seen better days. A plant that Lila had insisted I needed to make my workspace more homey, even though it was half dead and probably violating several fire codes. The security guard, a guy named Bob who I'd chatted with hundreds of times about the weather and the Steelers' latest disappointing season, couldn't even look at me as he walked me to the door. Bob, who knew my kids' names and had shown me pictures of his grandchildren, suddenly treated me like I was radioactive. The handshake Pete gave me at the door was the kind of limp, half-hearted gesture you'd give to someone with a contagious disease. "Good luck, Marcus," he said, already looking past me to the next crisis on his agenda. And just like that, I was standing in the parking lot at 11:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, holding a cardboard box and wondering what the hell I was supposed to do with the rest of my life. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and the world was going about its business like nothing had happened. Like Marcus Sullivan's career hadn't just been flushed down the corporate toilet. The drive home was a special kind of torture. Every red light felt personal. Every song on the radio was either too depressing or too upbeat. I kept practicing how I was going to tell Marissa, running through different approaches like I was preparing for a presentation. Casual. "Hey honey, funny story about work today." Direct. "I got fired." Optimistic. "Well, this gives me a chance to explore new opportunities." Nothing sounded right, because there's no good way to tell your wife that you've just become the poster child for economic uncertainty. I pulled into our driveway at 12:23 p.m., which was exactly the kind of random Tuesday afternoon timing that would make Marissa suspicious even before I opened my mouth. She was probably expecting me to walk through the door at 6:15 p.m. like always, maybe complain about Pete's latest brilliant idea or mention that the coffee machine in the break room was acting up again. Instead, she got me stumbling through the front door with a cardboard box and the kind of shell-shocked expression usually reserved for natural disaster survivors. She was standing in the kitchen, still in her yoga pants and oversized sweater, coffee cup in hand, like she was posing for some kind of suburban lifestyle magazine. For a split second, I thought maybe this could work out. Maybe she'd be supportive. Maybe we'd face this challenge together like the team we used to be. I should have known better. "You're home early," she said, and there was already an edge in her voice. Marissa had developed a sixth sense for trouble over the years, probably from dealing with me. "Yeah, about that." I set the box down on our kitchen island, right next to the fruit bowl we never used and the stack of mail she'd been meaning to go through for 3 weeks. She looked at the box, looked at me, and I watched her face go through the 5 stages of realization: confusion, recognition, anger, disgust, and finally, that cold calculation that meant I was about to get the verbal equivalent of a root canal without anesthesia. "They fired you." It wasn't a question. The whole department got cut. "Budget restructuring," they said. Of course they did. She set her coffee cup down hard enough that I was surprised it didn't shatter. "Of course this would happen now. Do you have any idea what kind of position this puts us in?" And there it was. Not, "I'm sorry this happened to you," or "We'll figure this out together," or even "That sucks, honey." Just immediate concern about how my failure was going to inconvenience her life. "I know this is tough, but I'll find something else. I've got experience, references." "References?" She laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. "Marcus, you worked the same job for 10 years. You never moved up, never tried to better yourself, never pushed for more responsibility. What exactly are you going to put on a resume that's going to impress anyone?" Each word hit like a physical blow. This was my wife, the woman who used to tell me she loved my steady nature, my reliability, my commitment to providing for our family. Now she was using those same qualities as weapons. "I worked hard for this family. You worked, Marcus. There's a difference." She started pacing, which was never a good sign. "You went to work, you came home, you watched TV, you went to bed. That's not working hard. That's just existing." I stood there holding my cardboard box of professional failure, watching the woman I'd loved for 12 years tear apart everything I thought I was. But she wasn't done. Not even close. She stopped pacing and looked me dead in the eyes with the kind of cold precision that would make a surgeon jealous. What she said next didn't just cut, it eviscerated. You know what, Marcus? I've been thinking about this for a while now, and today just confirms it. You're just a mistake I made. I'm taking the kids. The box slipped from my hands and hit the floor. 9 years, 8 months, and 16 days of my working life scattered across our kitchen tiles, but all I could hear were those words echoing in my head. A mistake I made. A mistake I made. A mistake I made. Marissa, wait. No, I'm done waiting. I'm done pretending this is working. I'm done making excuses for why I settled for someone with no ambition, no drive, no future. She was already moving, grabbing her purse, her keys, calling for Jordan and Lila. My children. My babies. Jordan, who was 8 and still believed I was the strongest man in the world. Lila, who was 6, and drew me pictures of us holding hands under rainbow skies. They came running when she called, backpacks already packed like she'd been planning this. Dad, Jordan looked confused, scared. Where are we going? I knelt down to their level, trying to find words that wouldn't scar them for life. You're going to stay with Aunt Claire for a little while, buddy. Mommy and Daddy need to figure some things out. Lila wrapped her arms around my neck. Are you coming too, Daddy? I felt my throat close up, felt everything I was supposed to be as a man, as a father, as a provider, crumbling around me. Not right now, sweetheart, but I'll see you soon, okay? Promise. That one word, spoken in my 6-year-old daughter's voice, broke something inside me that I didn't even know could break. Promise. Marissa herded them toward the door like she was evacuating a burning building, and maybe she was. Maybe our marriage, our family, our life together had been on fire for longer than I'd realized, and I'd just been too stupid or too stubborn to smell the smoke. I stood in my doorway, still in my work clothes, watching my wife load my children into her Honda Pilot. Jordan pressed his face to the window and waved at me, and I waved back like everything was normal, like this was just another Tuesday, like my whole world wasn't driving away in a used SUV with 87,000 miles on it. The taillights disappeared around the corner, and I was alone in a house that suddenly felt like a museum dedicated to a life I used to have. Their absence was so complete, so absolute, that I could hear the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking, the sound of my own breathing. I closed the door and leaned against it, staring at the cardboard box and its scattered contents on my kitchen floor. The coffee mug Jordan had made me lay on its side. World's okayest dad, staring up at me like an accusation. Okayest dad. Not even that, apparently. The day had started with an alarm clock at 5:30 a.m. and a routine I'd followed for almost 10 years. It was ending with me standing in an empty house, unemployed, separated, and wondering how everything I thought I was had disappeared in the span of a single afternoon. They say when it rains, it pours. But this wasn't rain. This was the complete and total demolition of Marcus Sullivan, and I was standing in the wreckage wondering if there was anything left worth salvaging. You know what they don't tell you about rock bottom? It's not actually a place you arrive at with some dramatic flourish and a neon sign that says, "Congratulations, your life officially sucks." No, rock bottom is more like quicksand. You keep thinking you've hit the worst of it, and then you sink a little deeper. I spent the first hour after Marissa left doing what any rational, mature adult would do in my situation. I sat on my couch and stared at the wall like it might suddenly start dispensing life advice or lottery numbers. The silence in the house was so thick you could have cut it with a butter knife and served it at a depression buffet. Every few minutes, I'd catch myself listening for Jordan's laugh or Lila's footsteps running down the hallway. Instead, I got the steady tick of the wall clock that Marissa had bought from some overpriced home decor store because it was rustic chic. Right now, it sounded less rustic chic and more like a time bomb counting down to my complete mental breakdown. By hour 2, I'd moved on to walking around the house like a ghost haunting his own life. I kept finding little reminders of the family I used to have. Lila's Barbie shoes under the coffee table, Jordan's Pokemon cards scattered on the kitchen counter, Marissa's coffee ring stains on the side table that I'd nagged her about for months. Funny how those stains didn't seem so important anymore. The refrigerator was covered in Lila's artwork, stick figure families with disproportionately large heads and smiles that took up half their faces. In every single drawing, there was me, identifiable by my brown hair and the fact that I was always holding her hand. Daddy and me at the park. Daddy and me making pancakes. Daddy and me and Rainbow. Each drawing was like a tiny knife to the chest, especially the one titled My Family, where she'd drawn all four of us under a house with a chimney that looked more like a rocket ship. We were all smiling in that picture, even the dog we didn't have, but that Lila kept insisting we needed. By hour 3, I was rifling through the junk drawer looking for, hell, I don't know what I was looking for. Maybe a manual titled, What to Do When Your Life Implodes in a Single Day, or a business card for a miracle worker who specialized in unfucking completely fucked situations. Instead, I found expired coupons for Pizza Hut, 17 different pins that didn't work, a warranty card for a toaster we'd thrown away 2 years ago, and a photo booth strip from Jordan's 7th birthday party at Chuck E. Cheese. All four of us crammed into that tiny booth, making goofy faces at the camera. Marissa was actually laughing in one of them, a real laugh, not the bitter, sarcastic kind that had become her trademark lately. That's when I realized I needed to get the hell out of that house before I completely lost it. The problem with spontaneous evening drives when your life has just gone up in flames is that you don't really have a destination in mind. You just drive, hoping that somehow the act of moving forward will translate into actual progress instead of just burning gas while your soul stays parked in the same miserable spot. I ended up on Route 9, the kind of two-lane highway that cuts through small towns like a surgical scar. It was past 8 o'clock, and the world had settled into that particular kind of darkness that makes everything look like a scene from a movie about people whose lives are falling apart. Which, considering my current situation, felt pretty damn appropriate. The radio was playing some country song about a guy whose wife left him for his best friend, because apparently the universe has a twisted sense of humor and thought I needed a soundtrack to my misery. I clicked it off and drove in silence, watching the occasional streetlight throw shadows across my windshield like it was putting on a puppet show about loneliness. That's when I saw it. A small roadside diner with a flickering neon sign that read, Mel's 24-hour cafe. Except the 24 was dark and the hour kept blinking like it had a nervous twitch. It was the kind of place that probably served coffee strong enough to wake the dead and pie that was either absolutely amazing or a health code violation waiting to happen. The parking lot had maybe 3 cars in it, which on any other night might have made me keep driving. But this wasn't any other night, and honestly, the idea of sitting in a booth surrounded by other people, even strangers, sounded better than going home to a house full of ghosts. The bell above the door jangled when I walked in, and the smell hit me immediately. Coffee, bacon grease, and that particular diner smell that's part nostalgia, part disinfectant, and part dreams deferred. It was exactly what you'd expect from a place called Mel's, assuming Mel had given up on interior decorating sometime around 1987 and never looked back. The decor was what you might charitably call vintage Americana, or, more accurately, stuff that was already outdated when it was new. Red vinyl booths with duct tape patches, a counter with stools that squeaked when you turned them, and walls covered with faded photographs of local high school football teams and what I assumed were Mel's family members looking uncomfortable in formal wear. There was a trucker at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee and staring at his phone like it contained the secrets of the universe. A middle-aged couple in one of the booths was having the kind of quiet, intense conversation that usually ends with someone sleeping on the couch. And in the far corner, an elderly woman sat alone, cutting her pie into precise, geometric pieces like she was performing surgery. The waitress looked like she'd been working there since the Carter administration, bleached blonde hair teased into a style that defied both gravity and good judgment, and a name tag that read Dolores in cheerful letters that seemed ironically optimistic given her expression. "Sit anywhere you want, hon," she called out, barely looking up from wiping down the counter with a rag that had seen better decades. I slid into a booth in the corner, partly because I wanted to be alone with my thoughts and partly because the vinyl was less cracked than the other options. The table was one of those Formica numbers with a pattern that looked like someone had spilled a kaleidoscope on it, and it was decorated with the kind of small, sticky rings that told the story of 1,000 coffee cups and a cleaning routine that was more aspirational than actual. Dolores appeared at my table with the kind of efficiency that comes from 40 years of practice and a complete lack of patience for small talk. She set down a coffee cup that looked like it had survived several minor earthquakes and filled it with coffee that was dark enough to be classified as a petroleum product. Menu? She asked, already reaching into her apron. Just coffee's fine, I said, because the idea of eating anything seemed about as appealing as performing my own root canal. She shrugged and moved on to refill the trucker's cup, leaving me alone with my coffee and my thoughts. The coffee was actually pretty good, strong enough to put hair on your chest and bitter enough to match my mood. I found myself staring into the dark surface, watching my reflection waver like I was looking into some kind of caffeinated crystal ball. That's when I noticed her watching me. The elderly woman in the corner had stopped dissecting her pie and was staring at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Not in a creepy way, but in the way that made you feel like you were being evaluated for something you hadn't signed up for. She was probably in her 70s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a bun that looked like it could survive a tornado and eyes that seemed way too sharp for someone her age. She was wearing a dark blue sweater that had probably been expensive once upon a time and a string of pearls that looked real enough to fund a small vacation. But it was her expression that got to me. She was looking at me like she'd seen a ghost, not scared, but shocked, like the universe had just played a practical joke on her that she wasn't sure how to handle. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my coffee and the ambient diner sounds, the sizzle of the grill, the murmur of conversation, the distant hum of the ice machine, having what sounded like a mechanical nervous breakdown. But I could feel her eyes on me, and after about 5 minutes of pretending to be fascinated by the sugar dispenser, I finally looked up and met her gaze. That's when she got up. She moved slowly, carefully, like someone who'd learned not to trust her own balance but was too stubborn to admit it. She carried her coffee cup in her purse, one of those structured leather jobs that probably weighed more than a small child, and approached my table with the kind of determined purpose usually reserved for people on important missions. "Excuse me," she said, and her voice had that particular quality that comes with age and a lifetime of speaking her mind. "I'm sorry to bother you, but..." She paused, studying my face like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "You look just like my son." Great, I thought. On top of everything else, now I'm attracting senior citizens with mommy issues. But there was something in her tone that kept me from being a complete ass about it. "That's nice," I said, trying to strike the right balance between polite and dismissive. "May I?" She gestured to the seat across from me. Every instinct I had told me to say no, to make some excuse about needing to get going, to avoid whatever emotional baggage this stranger was about to unload on me. But honestly, where the hell did I have to go? Home to my empty house and my wall of children's artwork? Back to driving aimlessly through the darkness like some kind of suburban ghost? "Sure," I said, and she slid into the booth with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to navigate the world despite a body that was no longer cooperating with her plans. She set her coffee cup down and arranged herself in the seat, smoothing her sweater and adjusting her purse strap like she was preparing for a job interview. Then she looked at me again with those sharp eyes, and I felt like I was being x-rayed. "My name is Agnes," she said. "Agnes Hartwell. And you really do look remarkably like my son, David." "Marcus," I said, because it seemed rude not to introduce myself to someone who'd just compared me to her offspring. "Marcus." She repeated my name like she was testing how it felt in her mouth. "That's a strong name. A good name. Thanks, I guess. My parents picked it." She smiled at that, just a small upturn of her lips that made her whole face soften. Parents do their best with names. "We hope we're giving our children something that will serve them well in life." There was something in the way she said it that made me pay attention, some undercurrent of sadness that I recognized because I'd been swimming in it myself all day. "So this son of yours," I said, partly out of politeness and partly because I was curious. "He live around here?" And that's when her face changed completely. The small smile disappeared, replaced by something that looked like pain wrapped in resignation and tied up with 35 years of regret. "No," she said quietly. "He's been missing for 35 years. The coffee in my mouth suddenly tasted like ash. I set the cup down carefully, watching as Agnes stared past me toward the diner's front window, her eyes focused on something I couldn't see. 35 years, she repeated, and her voice carried the weight of every single one of those days. "He would be about your age now, if..." She trailed off, leaving that thought hanging in the air between us like smoke. I didn't know what to say to that. What do you say to someone who's been carrying that kind of loss for 3.5 decades? Sorry, that sucks. Hope you find him someday. Everything sounded inadequate and stupid. I'm sorry, I said anyway, because it was all I had. She nodded, accepting my words with the grace of someone who'd heard them many times before. Thank you. It's strange, you know, seeing someone who looks so much like he did, like seeing a glimpse of the life that might have been. Agnes reached into her purse and pulled out an old wallet, the kind with plastic sleeves for photos. Her hands shook slightly as she flipped through it, and I found myself holding my breath as she found what she was looking for. This was David at 28, she said, sliding the photo across the table. I looked down at the picture and felt my stomach drop. The guy in the photo could have been my brother. Same dark hair, same jawline, same eyes that looked like they were trying to figure out what came next. He was standing next to a car, some kind of old Ford, wearing jeans and a t-shirt and smiling at whoever was taking the picture. Jesus, I whispered, because the resemblance was uncanny enough to be unsettling. He disappeared on a Tuesday in March 1990. Agnes continued, her voice taking on the mechanical quality of someone who'd told this story too many times. Left for work in the morning, never came home. They found his car 3 days later at a truck stop 200 miles away. No sign of him, no note, no explanation. Just gone. She took the photo back and stared at it for a long moment before tucking it away in her wallet. The police investigated, of course. Missing persons, all that. But David was 28, legally an adult, no signs of foul play. They assumed he'd left on his own, started a new life somewhere else. Her laugh was bitter. Maybe he did. Maybe he's got a family somewhere. Kids who don't know they have a grandmother who still sets an extra place at Christmas dinner. The weight of her sadness was crushing, and I found myself thinking about Jordan and Lila, about how they'd looked when Marissa loaded them into the car, about the promise I'd made to Lila that I'd see them soon. Have you ever stopped looking? I asked. Agnes shook her head. How do you stop looking for your child? Even when everyone tells you to move on, to accept that he's probably dead or doesn't want to be found. How do you just stop? She leaned forward slightly, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it hit me like a sledgehammer. But he's been missing for 35 years, and I've spent 35 years regretting every moment I didn't tell him I loved him, every time I chose work over time with him, every argument we had that I never got to take back. Her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me squirm. Don't abandon them like me, Marcus. Whatever's going wrong in your life, whatever brought you to this diner at this hour looking like the world just ended, don't abandon them like me. Agnes's words hit me like a freight train carrying a cargo load of uncomfortable truths, and suddenly I was drowning in memories I'd spent years trying not to think about. Sitting in that cracked vinyl booth with my lukewarm coffee and a stranger's grief weighing down the air between us, my mind decided to take an unauthorized trip down memory lane. The kind of trip where every stop is more depressing than the last. Don't abandon them like me. The words echoed in my head as I stared into my coffee cup, and suddenly I wasn't 34-year-old Marcus Sullivan sitting in a rundown diner. I was 8 years old again, standing in the doorway of my dad's garage, watching him work magic on engines that most people would have written off as scrap metal. Harold Sullivan, my old man, was the kind of guy who could make a 1987 Chevy Malibu with 200,000 miles on it purr like a satisfied cat. He had these massive hands that were permanently stained with motor oil and calloused from 40 years of honest work, but he could thread a bolt with the delicacy of a surgeon. Dad didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened, because Harold Sullivan had never wasted a word in his entire life. Come here, Marcus, he'd say, not looking up from whatever automotive puzzle he was solving that day. Let me show you something. And I'd run over like my shoes were on fire, because there was nothing cooler in my 8-year-old world than watching my dad turn a pile of mechanical junk into something that actually worked. He'd explain how the engine was like a heartbeat, how every part had to work together or the whole thing would fall apart. He taught me the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver, how to check oil, and why you never, ever shortcut a repair job. A man is measured by how he stands when the world crumbles around him, son, he told me one Saturday afternoon when we were working on Mrs. Henderson's ancient Buick. She couldn't afford to take it to the fancy shop downtown, So Dad fixed it for free and pretended like the $20 she insisted on giving him was adequate payment. It ain't about being the loudest or the smartest or the richest. It's about still being there when everyone else gives up and goes home. At the time, I thought he was talking about car repair. Turns out he was talking about life, and I'd been too young and stupid to realize I was getting the most important lesson I'd ever receive. Dad was diagnosed with lung cancer when I was 16. 2 packs a day for 30 years will do that to you, the doctor said with all the bedside manner of a tax auditor. He fought it for 18 months with the same quiet determination he brought to everything else, never complaining, never asking why him, just showing up for chemo appointments and radiation treatments like they were just another job that needed doing. The last conversation we had was in his hospital room 3 days before he died. He was so thin by then that he looked like a shadow of himself, but his eyes were still sharp, still focused. "You taking care of your mother?" he asked, because even with death knocking on his door, Harold Sullivan was worried about everyone else first. "Yeah, Dad. She's doing okay." "Good. That's good." He was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the parking lot like it contained the secrets of the universe. Then he turned back to me. "You remember what I taught you about standing firm?" "Yeah, Dad. I remember." "Good. You're gonna need that. Life's gonna try to knock you down more times than you can count, son. The measure of a man ain't whether he falls. Everybody falls. It's whether he gets back up." He died 2 days later in his sleep, and I swear the last thing he did was squeeze my mom's hand to let her know it was okay to let go. Mom, Leona, was the opposite of Dad in every way that mattered, which is probably why they worked so well together for 31 years. Where Dad was quiet, she was talkative. Where he was cautious, she was spontaneous. Where he fixed things with his hands, she fixed them with her heart and an endless supply of homemade cookies. Leona Sullivan believed in second chances the way other people believe in gravity, completely, without question, and with the understanding that the world would fall apart without them. She was the woman who'd invite the neighborhood kids in for lunch when their parents were working, who'd drive elderly Mrs. Peterson to doctor's appointments without being asked, who'd somehow always have an extra casserole in the freezer for families going through rough times. "Everyone deserves another chance, Marcus," she'd say whenever I'd complain about some kid at school being mean or some teacher being unfair. People don't wake up wanting to be difficult. Usually, they're just scared or hurt or overwhelmed. A little kindness goes a long way. She remarried when I was 22, a guy named Frank who owned a hardware store and treated her like she was made of precious metals. Some kids might have been weird about their mom dating someone new, but Frank made her laugh in a way I hadn't heard since Dad died, and that was enough for me. "Your father would have liked Frank," she told me at their wedding reception, dancing with me to some old Elvis song while Frank chatted with the relatives. "He would have appreciated a man who knows the value of treating people right." Mom died in a car accident when I was 26, just 2 weeks after Jordan was born. Some drunk asshole ran a red light and hit her car while she was coming home from the grocery store, carrying the stuffed elephant she'd bought for her new grandson. The irony wasn't lost on me. Leona Sullivan, who'd spent her entire life taking care of everyone else, killed by someone who couldn't be bothered to call a cab. I named Jordan after her maiden name. Jordan was her grandfather's name, the one who taught her about kindness and second chances. Marissa thought it was sweet at the time. Another thing that used to matter to her that she'd probably use as ammunition now. Sitting in that diner booth, watching Agnes carefully fold and unfold her napkin like it was a meditation, I realized how completely I'd failed to live up to the lessons my parents had spent years trying to teach me. Dad's lesson about standing firm when the world crumbles? I'd been knocked down by the first real punch life threw at me. Mom's lesson about kindness and second chances? I'd let bitterness and routine slowly poison my marriage until even I had trouble remembering why Marissa and I had fallen in love in the first place. Somewhere along the way, I'd traded Harold Sullivan's quiet strength for passive acceptance. I'd confused showing up with actually being present. I'd convinced myself that clocking in at the factory every day for 9 years and coming home to watch TV was the same thing as building a life worth living. "You okay, hon?" Dolores appeared at my elbow with a coffee pot, breaking me out of my trip down regret memory lane. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," I muttered, holding out my cup for a refill. Agnes was still sitting across from me, but she'd gone quiet, lost in her own memories. I wondered if she was thinking about David at 28, about all the conversations they'd never had and all the chances they'd never get to take back their last argument. "Can I ask you something?" I said, and she looked up from her napkin origami. "Of course. What was he like? Your son, I mean, David." A small smile crossed her face, the first genuine one I'd seen from her all evening. "Stubborn. God, was he stubborn. Once he made up his mind about something, you couldn't change it with dynamite and a crowbar." She paused, staring past me again. "But he was also loyal. Fiercely loyal. He'd defend his friends even when they didn't deserve it, help neighbors even when they hadn't been particularly neighborly to him. He worked construction, saved up for months to buy me a necklace for my 50th birthday. Said every woman deserved to feel beautiful, especially his mother. Sounds like a good guy. He was. He really was. But I spent so much time worried about him making the wrong choices that I forgot to appreciate the right ones. I worked double shifts at the hospital, thinking I was providing for him, thinking that money was the same thing as love. By the time I realized I'd been substituting showing up to work for showing up for my son, it was too late. The parallel hit me like a slap to the face. How many times had I used work as an excuse not to engage with Jordan and Lila? How many times had I told myself that providing for them financially was the same thing as being their father? How many school plays had I missed because I'd picked up overtime? How many bedtime stories had I skipped because I was too tired from another day of providing for my family? I thought being steady was enough, I said, more to myself than to Agnes. I thought showing up every day, keeping a job, paying the bills. I thought that was what being a man meant. And now, I thought about Marissa's words. "You're just a mistake I made," and how they'd cut deeper than losing my job ever could. I thought about Jordan's confused face when I told him I wouldn't be coming with them to Aunt Claire's. I thought about Lila's tiny arms around my neck and her voice asking me to promise I'd see her soon. "Now I think I confused existing with living," I said. I thought that if I just kept my head down and did what I was supposed to do, everything would work out. Like life was some kind of test where you get points for showing up and following the rules. Agnes nodded slowly. "David used to say that the world was full of people sleepwalking through their lives. He said most people spend so much time worried about tomorrow that they forget to live today. Smart kid. Too smart, maybe. He saw things other people missed. He'd notice when someone was sad, when they needed help, when they were pretending everything was fine. He couldn't stand seeing people suffer in silence." I thought about my dad fixing Mrs. Henderson's Buick for free, about my mom bringing casseroles to families in need, about the lessons they'd tried to teach me that I'd somehow managed to forget in the process of becoming a responsible adult. "My parents tried to teach me that," I said, "about standing firm, about kindness, about being there for people. Somewhere along the way, I guess I started thinking that meant just enduring, just getting through each day without falling apart." "Maybe," Agnes said gently. "The difference between enduring and standing firm is that one is about surviving and the other is about fighting for something worth surviving for." She finished her coffee and started gathering her things, her purse, her wallet with David's photo, her sweater that had probably seen decades of similar late-night conversations with strangers. "I should go," she said, sliding out of the booth with the careful movements of someone whose body had started betraying her. "But Marcus." "Yeah. Whatever brought you to this diner tonight, whatever's broken in your life, it's not too late to fix it. I've spent 35 years learning that lesson the hard way." She paused at my table, looking down at me with those sharp eyes that seemed to see straight through all my excuses and self-pity. "Don't abandon them like me," she repeated, and this time it wasn't just a warning. It was a plea from a mother who'd learned the difference between providing for someone and actually being there for them about 3 decades too late. I watched her walk to the counter, pay her check, and disappear into the night, leaving me alone with my cold coffee and the uncomfortable realization that I'd been sleepwalking through my own life for years. My parents had given me a blueprint for being a man worth respecting, Harold's quiet strength and Leona's endless capacity for second chances. Instead, I'd settled for being Marcus the factory guy, Marcus the reliable provider, Marcus who showed up but never really arrived. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to remember who Harold and Leona Sullivan had raised me to be. You know what's funny about marriage? Not funny haha, but funny in that twisted, cosmic joke kind of way. You can pinpoint the exact moment when you fell in love, but the moment when it all starts falling apart is like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. One day you're a team, and then suddenly you're two strangers sharing a mortgage and arguing about whose turn it is to take out the trash. Sitting in that diner, staring at the grease stains on the table while Agnes's words echoed in my head, I found myself thinking about Marissa, not the woman who'd looked me in the eye today and called me a mistake, but the girl I'd fallen for 12 years ago when we were both young enough to think love was enough to fix anything. We met at a barbecue at my buddy Steve's house. I was 22, fresh out of a community college program for industrial maintenance, and cocky as hell about landing my first real job at the factory. Marissa was 20, working part-time at a dental office while finishing her associate's degree in business administration, and she had this laugh that could make you forget your own name. She was wearing a sundress with little flowers on it. Yellow daisies, I think, and she was arguing with Steve's girlfriend about whether The Godfather was better than Goodfellas. Most girls I knew didn't have opinions about Scorsese movies, but Marissa was defending her position like she was presenting a thesis, complete with specific examples and a ranking system for mob movie criteria. "You're wrong," I'd said, walking up to their conversation with a beer in my hand and all the confidence of a guy who hadn't been shot down yet that night. "Excuse me." She turned those green eyes on me, and I felt my carefully prepared argument about cinematography evaporate like spit on a hot sidewalk. "I mean, I think you're right. About The Godfather. It's definitely better." She smiled, this slow, amused smile that let me know she'd seen right through my smooth operator routine. "Oh, really? And what makes you such an expert on mob movies?" "Well, I've seen both of them. Twice." She laughed then, and it was like someone had turned on the lights in a room I didn't even know was dark. "Wow, twice. I'm clearly dealing with a film scholar here." We spent the next 3 hours sitting on Steve's back porch, talking about movies and music and the kinds of dreams you only share when you're young enough to believe they might actually come true. She wanted to own her own business someday, something in event planning or hospitality management. I told her about my plans to work my way up at the factory, maybe get into supervision, eventually buy a house with a garage where I could work on cars like my dad had. "You make me feel safe, Marcus," she said that night as I walked her to her car. "Like you're the kind of person who shows up when he says he will." Safe. That word followed me home that night and through the next week while I worked up the courage to call her. Safe wasn't sexy or exciting, but coming from Marissa, it felt like the highest compliment anyone had ever given me. In a world full of guys who were all flash and no substance, I was the steady one, the reliable one, the one who'd still be there when the excitement wore off. And for a while, God, for a long while, that was enough. Our first apartment was a shithole one-bedroom above a Chinese restaurant that made the whole place smell like sweet and sour pork, but we were so happy we might as well have been living in a palace. Marissa would come home from her job at the dental office, and I'd come home from the factory, and we'd sit on our second-hand couch eating takeout and planning our future like we were the first couple in history to figure out how this whole love thing was supposed to work. She'd curl up against my side while we watched TV, running her fingers through my hair and telling me about her day. The difficult patients, the office drama, the way Dr. Martinez would hit on the dental hygienists and act like he was God's gift to women with dental insurance. I'd tell her about the machinery I'd fixed, the guys I worked with, the satisfaction of solving problems with my hands instead of sitting behind a desk all day. "I love that about you," she'd say. "You actually make things work. You fix things instead of just complaining about them." We got married 3 years later in a small ceremony at her parents' church. Nothing fancy. We couldn't afford fancy, but Marissa looked like something out of a fairy tale in a dress she'd found at a consignment shop and altered herself. During our vows, she promised to love me for better or worse, in good times and bad, through whatever life throws at us. I believed her. Hell, I believed both of us. The first crack in our perfect little world appeared about a year after Jordan was born. Marissa had taken maternity leave from the dental office, and the combination of sleep deprivation, hormones, and being stuck in the house all day had turned my easygoing wife into someone I barely recognized. "I feel like I'm disappearing," she told me one night after Jordan had finally fallen asleep. "Like I'm just Jordan's mom and Marcus's wife, but I'm not Marissa anymore." "You're still Marissa," I'd said, because it seemed like the right thing to say. Am I? When's the last time I did something just for me? When's the last time we had a conversation that wasn't about diapers or bills or whose turn it is to do laundry? I didn't have an answer for that, mainly because she was right. Our conversations had become logistics meetings: who was picking up Jordan from daycare, whether we needed milk, why the water bill was higher this month. We'd stopped talking about dreams and movies in the future and started talking about immediate problems that needed immediate solutions. It's just a phase, I told her. All new parents go through this. But it wasn't just a phase. It was the beginning of a slow erosion that would take years to complete, like water wearing away stones so gradually that you don't notice the damage until the whole foundation crumbles. When Lila came along 2 years later, things got worse instead of better. Marissa went back to work part-time, but she was exhausted all the time, and I was picking up extra shifts to cover the additional expenses. Our conversations became even more transactional: grocery lists and school schedules, and who was going to stay home with sick kids. "You never really talk to me anymore," she said one night while we were folding laundry in front of the TV. "You come home, you eat dinner, you watch whatever game is on, and you go to bed. It's like living with a roommate who occasionally pays bills." "I'm tired, Marissa. I work 40+ hours a week, so you can work part-time and be home with the kids more. What do you want from me? I want you to want to talk to me. I want you to ask about my day and actually listen to the answer. I want you to notice when I get my hair cut or when I'm having a hard time with something. I notice things." "Really? What did I do today before you got home?" I stared at the TV, trying to remember if she'd mentioned anything that morning over breakfast. Had she said something about taking the kids somewhere? Meeting someone for lunch? Going to the store? "I don't know," I admitted. Took Lila to her pediatrician appointment. Dropped Jordan off at soccer practice. Grocery shopped. Picked up your dry cleaning. Paid bills. Called your mother to wish her happy birthday. Made dinner. And helped Jordan with his homework. But you don't know because you never ask. That fight ended like most of our fights, with both of us apologizing and promising to do better, and then falling back into the same patterns a week later. I tried to be more engaged for a few days, asking about her day and making an effort to put down my phone during dinner. She tried to be more understanding about how tired I was after work. But eventually, we'd slip back into our respective corners, coexisting instead of connecting. The real poison, though, came from her family. Specifically, her sister Claire, who'd married some hotshot lawyer and lived in a house that was featured in the local magazine's Homes of Distinction issue. Claire had opinions about everything: our car, our neighborhood, my job, my clothes, and especially my apparent lack of ambition. "Marcus seems comfortable," she'd say during family gatherings, making comfortable sound like a terminal illness. "Some people are just content with where they are, I suppose." Her friends weren't much better. A bunch of wine mom types who spent their days at yoga classes and charity luncheons, married to guys who wore suits to work and talked about investment portfolios at dinner parties. They'd ask what I did for a living, and when I said I worked at the factory, they'd get that look, the one that said they were already calculating how quickly they could change the subject. "Marissa, you're so lucky to have such a practical husband," one of them said at a barbecue last summer. "Someone who's not caught up in all that career ambition nonsense." But Marissa stopped feeling lucky. Slowly, steadily, my reliability became stagnation in her eyes. My contentment with providing for my family became lack of drive. My satisfaction with honest work became settling for mediocrity. "Don't you want more?" she asked me during one of our increasingly frequent arguments about money. "Don't you want to move up, make more money, give the kids better opportunities?" "I make decent money. We have a nice house. The kids are happy. Decent money. A nice house." She repeated my words like they tasted bitter. "God, Marcus, is that really all you want out of life? To be decent? To be fine? To be okay? What's wrong with okay?" "Everything," she exploded. "Everything is wrong with okay. Okay is giving up. Okay is settling. Okay is looking at your life and deciding that this is as good as it gets." That conversation happened 6 months ago, but I could still hear the frustration in her voice, the way she said, "okay," like it was a 4-letter word. And maybe, sitting in that diner with Agnes's warning still ringing in my ears, I was finally starting to understand what she meant. I'd spent so many years thinking that showing up was enough that I'd stopped trying to actually excel at anything. I'd convinced myself that steady was the same thing as strong, that reliable was the same thing as remarkable. I'd taken the lessons my parents taught me about standing firm and twisted them into an excuse for standing still. Somewhere along the way, "You make me feel safe" had become, "You make me feel trapped," and I'd been too comfortable in my own contentment to notice the difference. My wife had stopped seeing me as her partner and started seeing me as an obstacle to the life she actually wanted. And the hell of it was, she wasn't entirely wrong. I had gotten comfortable. I had stopped pushing for more. I had settled into a routine that felt like success, but probably looked like surrender to anyone watching from the outside. "You're just a mistake I made." The words hit differently now, sitting in that booth with cold coffee and colder realizations. Not just cruel, but accurate. Because the man she'd fallen in love with, the one who'd had dreams and ambitions and plans for the future, had gradually been replaced by someone who was content to clock in, come home, and repeat the same day over and over until death or retirement, whichever came first. Maybe I really had become a mistake. Maybe the Marcus she'd married had disappeared so slowly that neither of us had noticed until it was too late to get him back. Agnes had been gone for maybe 10 minutes, but her presence still lingered in that booth like the ghost of conversations past. I was nursing what had to be my fourth cup of Dolores's industrial-strength coffee, staring at the sugar dispenser and trying to process everything that had just happened when she came back. I looked up, surprised to see her standing next to my table again, clutching her purse like it contained state secrets. Her face was different now, more determined, less fragile. Like she'd walked out to her car, sat there for a few minutes, and made some kind of decision that required her to march back in here and finish what she'd started. "I'm sorry," she said, sliding back into the booth across from me without asking permission this time. "I couldn't leave without telling you something else." "Okay," I said, because what else do you say to a woman who's been carrying 35 years of regret around like a backpack full of rocks? She leaned forward, her hands flat on the table, and when she spoke, her voice had the intensity of someone confessing their deepest sin. "I worked too much when David was growing up. Double shifts at the hospital, overtime whenever I could get it. I told myself I was providing for him, giving him opportunities one never had." Her eyes were locked on mine, and I felt like she was seeing straight through to all the excuses I'd been making for the past decade. But the truth is, I was hiding. Work was easier than being a parent, easier than having difficult conversations, easier than dealing with his problems, easier than admitting I had no idea what I was doing half the time. The words hit me like a punch to the gut because I recognized the pattern. How many times had I picked up extra shifts instead of going to Jordan's baseball games? How many times had I claimed I was working late when really I just didn't want to deal with Marissa's complaints about our finances or our marriage or my apparent lack of ambition? When David was 17, he wanted to talk to me about something. I could tell it was important. He kept starting sentences and then stopping, kept hovering around the kitchen while I was getting ready for work. But I was already running late, and Mrs. Patterson in room 314 needed her medication adjusted. And there was always something that seemed more urgent than whatever my teenage son wanted to discuss. She paused, and I watched her fingers trace patterns on the table like she was writing invisible apologies. I told him we'd talk when I got home. "Later, David. We'll talk later." But when I got home at midnight, he was already asleep, and the next morning he was rushing off to school. And then there was another shift, another emergency, another excuse to put off that conversation. "Did you ever find out what he wanted to talk about?" Agnes shook her head, and I saw tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. "That's the thing about later, Marcus. Sometimes later never comes." A few months after that, David graduated and got his own apartment. He'd call every couple of weeks, but the calls got shorter and shorter. He was pulling away, and I told myself it was natural, that boys his age needed independence. She took a shaky breath. The morning he disappeared, he called me at work. Said he needed to talk, asked if I could meet him for lunch. But I had 3 patients scheduled and a staff meeting, and I told him, I told him I was too busy. I said we'd talk that weekend. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of missed opportunities and words that would never be spoken. "That weekend never came," she whispered. "And I've spent 35 years wondering what he wanted to tell me, wondering if maybe he was in some kind of trouble and needed help, wondering if I'd just listened. If I'd just made time for one conversation, he might still be here." She reached across the table and grabbed my hand with surprising strength, her eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made me want to look away but couldn't. Don't abandon them like me, Marcus. 5 words. 5 simple words that hit me like a lightning bolt, illuminating every corner of my soul where I'd been hiding from the truth about what kind of father I'd become. Not don't leave them, or don't give up on them, but don't abandon them like me. Because abandonment isn't just about packing up and disappearing. Sometimes it's about being physically present but emotionally absent. Sometimes it's about choosing work over bedtime stories, overtime over family dinners, the safety of routine over the messy, complicated work of actually connecting with the people you love. I sat there staring at this woman who'd just handed me the roadmap to every mistake I'd been making for years, and I finally understood what she was really telling me. She wasn't just warning me not to leave my kids. She was warning me not to be the kind of father who's always too busy for the conversations that matter, too tired for the moments that count, too comfortable with later to realize that later might never come. I hear you, I said, and my voice came out rougher than I expected. Agnes squeezed my hand one more time, and then let go, sitting back in the booth with the exhausted expression of someone who'd just transferred 35 years of hard-earned wisdom to a stranger in a diner. Good, she said simply. That's all I wanted. For someone to hear what I should have learned before it was too late. Something shifted inside me when Agnes said those 5 words, something I hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. It wasn't anger, though God knows I had plenty of that swirling around after the day I'd had. It wasn't desperation either, though I'd been drowning in that particular emotion since Marissa loaded the kids into her car and drove away from our house, like she was fleeing a crime scene. No, this was something else entirely. Something that felt like waking up after a long, dreamless sleep to find out you've been sleepwalking through your own life. For the first time all day, hell, for the first time in years, I felt resolve. Real, honest-to-God determination that came from somewhere deeper than my wounded pride or my fear of being alone. It came from that place where you store the things that actually matter, the place I'd been ignoring while I focused on showing up. To work and paying bills and convincing myself that going through the motions was the same thing as living. Agnes, I said, and she looked up from her coffee cup with those sharp eyes that seemed to see everything I'd been trying to hide from myself. I don't know if I have the strength to face Marissa right now. I don't know if I'm strong enough to fight for something that might already be dead. It was the first completely honest thing I'd said out loud in months, maybe years. Not the kind of filtered, careful honesty you use when you're trying to avoid an argument, but the raw, ugly truth that makes your chest tight and your throat close up. Agnes reached across the table and grabbed my hand again. But this time her grip was different. Not the desperate clutch of someone drowning in regret, but the firm, steady hold of someone who'd learned the hard way what was worth fighting for. Strength doesn't wait for permission, Marcus, she said, and her voice had the authority of someone who'd spent 35 years learning that lesson the most painful way possible. It doesn't show up when you feel ready, or when the circumstances are perfect, or when you're sure you're going to win. She leaned forward, and I could see decades of hard-earned wisdom written in the lines around her eyes. Strength shows up when you realize that not fighting is worse than losing. When you understand that giving up means living with the kind of regret that follows you around like a shadow for the rest of your life. Her words hit me like a slap that wakes you up from a bad dream. Because she was right. Not fighting meant accepting that I was the kind of man who'd let his children grow up believing their father didn't think they were worth the effort. Not fighting meant proving Marissa right about me being a mistake she'd made. Go to them, Agnes said, and now her voice was gentle but insistent, like a mother talking to a child who's afraid to get back on a bike after falling. Tonight. Right now. Don't wait until tomorrow or next week or when you feel more prepared. Don't give yourself time to talk yourself out of it. I felt something ignite in my chest. Not the raging fire of anger or the desperate flame of panic, but the steady, sustainable burn of purpose. For the first time in years, I had a clear mission that had nothing to do with clocking in or paying bills or maintaining the status quo. I had to get to my kids. I had to look Jordan and Lila in the eyes and tell them that their father wasn't the kind of man who disappeared when things got difficult. I had to prove to myself, and maybe to Marissa, that Marcus Sullivan still had some fight left in him. Thank you, I said to Agnes, but the words felt inadequate for what she'd just given me. She smiled. the first truly warm smile I'd seen from her all night. Don't thank me, Marcus. Just don't abandon them like me. I left a $10 bill on the table, grabbed my jacket, and headed for the door with the kind of determined stride I hadn't used in years. Outside, the night air hit my face like a wake-up call, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I walked toward my car. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, but not from fear or uncertainty. They were shaking with the kind of adrenaline that comes when you finally stop running away from something and turn around to face it head-on. I was driving toward my children, toward the most important fight of my life, and for once I wasn't worried about whether I was strong enough or prepared enough or good enough. I was just going. The drive to Claire's house felt like the longest 23 minutes of my life, which is saying something considering I'd already lived through the worst day in recent memory. Every red light felt personal, every slow driver felt like a conspiracy, and every mile marker reminded me that I was driving toward a confrontation I had no idea how to handle. Claire lived in one of those suburban developments where all the houses looked like they were designed by the same architect who'd been told to make everything charming, but had never actually experienced charm himself. Perfect lawns, perfect driveways, perfect little mailboxes that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. It was the kind of neighborhood where having a lawnmower that wasn't a riding mower marked you as lower class, and where the homeowners association had opinions about your choice of garden gnomes. Marissa's Honda Pilot was parked in the driveway next to Claire's BMW, looking as out of place as I felt pulling up behind them in my 10-year-old Ford pickup with the dent in the tailgate from that time Jordan decided to help me load lumber and miscalculated the distance. I sat in my truck for a minute, engine still running, trying to figure out what the hell I was going to say. Agnes had filled me with all this resolve and determination, but she hadn't exactly provided a script for this situation. Hey Marissa, I know you think I'm a complete failure as a human being, but can I see my kids? Didn't seem like it was going to win me any points. The front door opened before I could finish psyching myself up, and there she was, my wife of 9 years, standing in Claire's perfectly manicured doorway with her arms crossed, and that expression on her face that I'd seen way too often lately. The one that said she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever pathetic argument I was about to make. Go home, Marcus, she called out before I'd even gotten out of the truck. This isn't the time. But something was different this time. Maybe it was Agnes's words still echoing in my head, or maybe it was the realization that I'd already lost everything that mattered anyway. So what was the worst that could happen? For the first time in years, I didn't feel that familiar urge to back down, to avoid the confrontation, to take the path of least resistance. I'm not leaving without seeing Jordan and Lila, I said, walking up her perfectly paved walkway with more confidence than I'd felt in years. Marissa's eyebrows shot up like I'd just announced I was running for president. Excuse me. You heard me. I want to see my kids. She stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind her like she was protecting Fort Knox from enemy infiltration. Marcus, you can't just show up here making demands. We talked about this. No, you talked about this. You made a unilateral decision to blow up our family and take my children away from me. I never agreed to any of it. Oh, please. She rolled her eyes with the kind of dramatic flair that would have made high school theater teachers proud. Don't act like you're some innocent victim here. You've been checked out of this marriage for years. Maybe I have been. Maybe we both have. But those are my kids in there, and I'm not going anywhere until I see them. Something in my tone must have gotten through to her, because her expression shifted slightly, not to agreement, exactly, but to surprise. Like she was seeing something in me that she'd forgotten existed, or maybe something that had never been there before. They're upset, Marcus. They don't understand what's happening, and seeing you right now. Dad. Jordan's voice cut through our standoff like a knife through butter. He was standing behind the screen door, still in his pajamas with his hair sticking up in 17 different directions, looking at us with those big brown eyes that were way too serious for an 8-year-old. Hey, buddy, I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. Before Marissa could stop him, before anyone could stop him, Jordan pushed open the screen door and ran straight into my arms. 8 years old and already tall for his age, he hit me with the force of a small linebacker, wrapping his arms around my waist like he was afraid I might disappear if he didn't hold on tight enough. I thought you weren't coming, he said into my shirt, and I felt something break apart inside my chest. I'm here now, Jordan. I'm here. Dad, Dad, Dad. Lila's voice carried from inside the house. And then she was there too, all blonde curls and princess pajamas, launching herself at my legs with the fearless enthusiasm that only 6-year-olds possess. I knelt down so I could wrap both of them in my arms, and for the first time all day, the world felt like it made sense again. This was why Agnes's words had hit me so hard. This was what I'd been in danger of abandoning. Not through some dramatic exit, but through the slow, steady erosion of just not showing up when it mattered. Are you staying for breakfast, Daddy? Lila asked, looking up at me with those blue eyes that were identical to her mother's. I glanced up at Marissa, who was standing on the porch watching this reunion with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not the cold anger from earlier, but something more complicated. I don't know, sweetheart. That's up to Mommy. Claire's living room looked like it had been designed by someone who thought cozy meant aggressively beige. Everything matched in that soul-crushing way that screams, I hired a decorator and have no actual personality. But right now, sitting on her overpriced sectional with my kids curled up against me like they were afraid I might vanish, it felt like the most important room in the world. Daddy, why can't you come home with us? Lila asked, her small hand gripping my shirt with the determination of someone who'd learned not to let go of good things. I looked at Jordan, who was pretending to be interested in the TV, but was clearly listening to every word. At 8, he was old enough to sense the weight of adult problems even if he couldn't fully understand them. Sometimes grown-ups have problems they need to figure out, I said, choosing my words carefully. Mommy and Daddy are having some disagreements about things, but that doesn't change how much we love you guys. Are you getting divorced? Jordan asked bluntly, because kids have a way of cutting straight through all the bullshit adults use to avoid difficult conversations. Marissa shifted uncomfortably in the armchair across from us, and I could feel Claire hovering in the doorway like she was watching a particularly dramatic episode of her favorite soap opera. I don't know, buddy. Maybe. But here's what I do know. No matter what happens between Mommy and me, I will always be your dad. That never changes, no matter where we live or what paperwork gets signed. Promise. Lila looked up at me with those serious blue eyes that made my chest tight. Promise. Even if I can't live in the same house with you, even if things get complicated and confusing, I will never stop being your father. I will never stop showing up for you. Claire, who'd been suspiciously quiet through this whole exchange, finally spoke up. Marissa, maybe you should let him talk to them. They need to hear this. I nearly fell off the couch. Claire, the same Claire who'd been making subtle digs about my lack of ambition for years, was suddenly on my side. Marissa looked like she'd been slapped. Claire, we talked about this. We talked about you being angry and hurt. We didn't talk about what's best for Jordan and Lila. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt like someone other than Agnes understood what was really at stake here. This wasn't just about Marissa and me working out our marital problems. This was about two kids who needed to know their father wouldn't disappear from their lives just because their parents couldn't figure out how to be married anymore. Look, I said, addressing Marissa directly but keeping my voice calm. I'm not here to argue with you or try to change your mind about us. If you want a divorce, we'll figure that out. But I'm not going to let my kids think their dad gave up on them. Marissa stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her processing this version of Marcus. The one who didn't back down, who didn't apologize for taking up space, who finally understood the difference between being present and just showing up. Fine, she said quietly. But this doesn't fix anything between us. I know, I replied. But maybe it fixes something between me and them. The weeks that followed were brutal in ways I hadn't expected. Marissa made it crystal clear that whatever moment of understanding we'd shared in Claire's living room didn't magically fix our marriage. She was still ice-cold toward me, still convinced I was a mistake she needed to correct, but at least she wasn't blocking me from seeing Jordan and Lila. Small victories, I guess. I moved into a studio apartment above Murphy's Bar on 3rd Street, the kind of place that came furnished if you counted a mattress on the floor and a card table as furniture. It smelled like beer and regret, but it was mine, and more importantly, it was temporary. A place to figure out what came next, not a place to give up and die. The job hunt was its own special kind of humiliation. Turns out, reliable factory worker for 10 years, doesn't exactly make employers fight over you when half the guys my age have college degrees and the other half have skills that don't involve operating machinery that's probably older than my kids. But I wasn't the same Marcus who'd gotten fired 3 weeks ago. That guy would have gotten discouraged after the 5th rejection, would have started making excuses about the job market, and settled for whatever scraps he could find. The new version of me, the one Agnes had helped wake up, kept knocking on doors. I picked up part-time work wherever I could find it. Delivery driver for Murphy's Pizza, weekend mechanic at Joe's Auto Repair, using the skills my dad had taught me back when I still believed I could fix anything. Construction cleanup crew for a development project across town. None of it paid great, but it paid, and more importantly, it kept me moving forward instead of wallowing in self-pity. "You finally look alive, Marcus," my brother Daniel said when he stopped by my crappy apartment with a six-pack and a worried expression. Beat to hell, but alive. He wasn't wrong. I was exhausted most days, juggling 3 part-time jobs and trying to spend every free moment with my kids. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was actually living instead of just existing. The real reward came in small moments. Jordan asking for my help with his science project instead of just accepting Mom's offer to do it for him. Lila bringing me drawings of our new adventures. Together, stick figures of us at the park, at McDonald's, building blanket forts in my tiny apartment. Slowly, steadily, my children were learning that their father wasn't the kind of man who disappeared when life got complicated. 2 months after that night at the diner, I found myself driving past Mel's 24-hour cafe again. The neon sign was still flickering like it had a nervous condition, and the parking lot still looked like a scene from a movie about people whose lives were falling apart. But this time, I wasn't one of them. I walked in looking for Agnes, wanting to thank the woman who'd saved my life without even knowing it. I wanted to tell her about Jordan's science fair trophy, about Lila's latest artwork covering my apartment fridge, about how I'd finally learned the difference between showing up and actually being present. Dolores was still behind the counter, still looking like she'd been there since the Carter administration, still wielding that ancient coffee pot like a weapon of caffeinated mass destruction. "Excuse me," I said. "A couple months ago, there was an elderly woman here. Agnes. Agnes Hartwell." Dolores frowned, wiping down the same spot on the counter she'd probably been cleaning for decades. "Agnes. You mean Agnes Carter? Honey, she passed away about 4 years ago. Cancer, I think." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood there staring at this woman who'd just casually mentioned that my guardian angel had been dead for years, trying to process what that meant. "You okay, hon?" Dolores asked, because apparently I looked like I'd seen a ghost. Which, I guess, maybe I had. I drove home to my kids in a daze, Agnes's words echoing in my head. Don't abandon them like me. Whether she'd been real or some kind of caffeine-induced hallucination brought on by the worst day of my life, her message had been exactly what I needed to hear when I needed to hear it. Now I understand what my dad meant about standing firm when the world crumbles. It's not about being immovable. It's about knowing what's worth fighting for and refusing to let go of it, no matter how hard life tries to shake you loose. I may have lost a job. I may have lost a marriage. But I found something more important. I found out that Marcus Sullivan is still a father, still a man worth respecting, still someone who shows up when it matters. And that's enough reason to keep standing.